Hi, it's such a big pleasure being here at Link, talking about my research. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Daniel Teixeira Prieto, and today I'll be talking a little bit the paper I wrote alongside my advisor, Sergio Nesteriuk. The work's named Crunch, Analysis of the Phenomenon in the Independent Game Development Scene. The keywords for the paper are crunch, crunch time, independent games, and video games industry. Before I continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank Capis, who funds my research and made this work possible. Now, many of you might be wondering what exactly is crunch? Well, crunch or crunch time is a term that the games industry lent from the sports world. In basketball, crunch time refers to the final minutes of a close ball game in which both teams play extra hard in order to secure a win. In the games industry, though, it refers to the time span of an intense labor during the development of a video game. This is intense labor coming up to 90 hours per week with unpaid overtime. Unlike basketball, the crunch time in game development does not last 5 minutes. It can last for weeks, months, and even years. But why? What goes on in the games industry for this to happen? Edholm and Lindstrom have some points about it. They argue that a couple of things called feature and scope creep are to blame. Feature creep is when new features are planned to be added to the game, but end up being way more complex than anticipated. They take a lot more time and effort. This often leads to scope creep, which is that the scope of the project is now unrealistic because the work to be put in the features was miscalculated. Now we have work overload because this leads to schedule and planning issues. There's more work to do in the same or even a smaller amount of time. Because of it, another problem comes into play, which is the conflict and ambiguity of roles. Among the chaos of an approaching deadlines, everyone does a little bit of everything, and there's a sense of never-ending work. And the workers do it because in the games industry there is a widespread culture of overtime. If the team lead stays late, the whole team stays late. Nobody even has to ask. It's just expected of them. They are passionate about their game, they're passionate about their work, and they will do whatever it takes to complete it. Well, we could solve this if there was no feature and no scope creep, right? Everything would be on schedule and running smoothly. In theory, yes. But Shaya 2018 shows us that the games industry is a little bit more complex than that. There are 5 reasons for game development to be so complex. The first of them is that games are interactive and different from movies. Every single detail has to be thought through because the player will not only see what the camera shows, but the player controls the camera. And so everything has to be implemented correctly and thought through thoroughly. The second aspect is ever-changing technologies. New, flashier, more complex tech is released on a daily basis and developers have to keep up with it, learn new things and work with cutting-edge software before it's even ready for public use. Along the same lines, there's a wide variety of tools. There are a ton of 3D modeling tools, digital painting, sculpting, scripting software, and not all of them are compatible. This means that often the devs must learn new softwares or find ways to make them compatible. Fourth is that fun is unpredictable. You simply cannot tell if a game is going to be fun until at least a good chunk of it is done. And by the time that the good chunk of the game is done, you already spent a great deal of money, a great deal of time, and a great deal of effort. And if it's not fun, it all goes down the drain. And lastly, all of this leads to schedule unpredictability. The amount of moving parts it takes to make a game raises entropy through the roof. And it's very hard to predict how long everything will take. Colt and Harris agree, and in their words, video games are an unmanageable creative industry. Adding to the chaotic mess, they observe an anti-corporate ethos within the industry. Again, in their words, it's the ways in which developers' nostalgia for games' early era of garage development led them to reject organizational structures and systems. And with it comes passion, perfectionism, and the previously mentioned culture of overtime. Now, with it, there are many consequences. This unhealthy relation to work leads to psychopathological diseases among workers, such as, but not limited to, the burnout syndrome. Another big consequence is of institutionalized sexism within the industry. Unfortunately, in our society, women have to withstand household obligations more often than not, such as taking care of children. And in this case, the industry understands that women, especially married women, are unable to cope with crunch and are often disqualified by recruiters. This was observed by Haynes and Woodcock. Now, clearly, this would have deep impacts on the workers' personal lives and relationships, and it has. and it was already brought to public multiple times. The first time was in 2004 by a forum user under the name EA Spouse, who wrote an article stating the profound negative effects that EA's way of work had on her husband and her family. 5 years later, not one but several spouses of Rockstar Games workers' wives came forward under the name Rockstar Wives, demanding better work conditions for their husbands and also claiming that the company jeopardized their families in many different ways. With this, it's not a mystery why most developers abandon the industry within 3 to 9 years of service, as observed by Colt and Harris. Well, so far we've talked about the video games mainstream industry, the AAA industry, as we call it. Yet, here lies the main inquiry of this paper. What about the independent game developers? So that we are in the clear and that everyone knows what we are considering to be independent in this work, we have used Guarda and Grabarczyk 2016 parameters, having independence threefold. First of all, being financial independent, which means that developer is its own funding agent. Creative independency, which means that the developer is its own target audience. And distribution independency, the developer is its own publisher. It is also important to note that a game might be more or less independent depending on how many criteria it fits. Well, now that we know what we consider to be independent, what are the thoughts of these independent developers on crunch? In order to understand this, we've analyzed self-declared independent games post-mortem documents, dated between 2009 and 2017. Out of the 29 game documents, 23 fitted our independence parameters, and out of these 23, 9 mentioned crunch, 3 mentioned it as a negative aspect, 5 made no value judgment, and 1 even considered it a positive aspect of development. Though it is not known how the 14 remaining game development teams feel about crunch, as they didn't mention it in the postmortem. The numbers are better than the mainstream industry still. The IGDA, or International Game Developers Association, published that 42% of the industry's employees claim that crunch is not only imposed on them, but it's already expected of them. Additionally, I'd like to highlight one specific example of independent crunch we believe can be very enlightening on the matter, the case of Eric Barone, Stardew Valley's developer, as narrated by Schreier 2018. Barone spent 5 years developing the game, out of which 4 he did it in a completely independent way. Yet, he reported to have worked 12 plus hours a day every day for 5 years. He also has stated that in the last year of production, with the help of a publisher, he could better focus on the job and leave legal and distribution matters to other professionals. However, this came at a cost, being constantly pressured to finish the game to a point that it jeopardized his personal relations. Barone eventually released the game and became one of the most prominent indie millionaires in the scene, but what is of interest is how crunch remained an aspect, even if nobody asked him to do it, for years, and how it has increased with the presence of a publisher. We believe that this is a matter not only of game developers, although it is enhanced in this field. I'd like to read a quote from Lafag's 1883, The Right to be Lazy. A strange kind of madness is taking over the working class in the capitalist civilization. This madness is the love for labor, a furious passion for labor, leading to the exhaustion of the vital forces of himself, the worker, and his children. This process has begun in the 19th century and it has been carried over to the 21st century. Furthermore, we recognize a different source of exploitation and coercion between the mainstream and the independent industries. The mainstream industry is fitted within Foucault's disciplinary society, in which the leads, producers, CEOs coerce and exploit the workers. Now, in the case of the independent, they are fit in Byung-Chul Han's burnout society, in which they are both the aggressor and the victim. They exploit and coerce themselves. In the case of the independent, the line between work and personal lives is blurred, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, in which most people were working where they ate, where they relaxed, loved, and slept. Considering Clary's 24/7 work, the lack of rest and recovery intensifies all prior negative effects. And now what? In conclusion, considering that we've established the dependency factors as influent in the incidence of crunch, we consider that the independent way shows itself a better game-making strategy, although it's not perfect, since we've also seen that the 21st century social panorama and the burnout society are major roots to the problem. Being fully independent seems to distance developers from crunch, once that we've also established that pressure from publishers and funding agents increase the incidence of crunch. If anyone feels like getting in touch and discussing the future of this beautiful medium, I will leave both mine and Sergio's email on screen and we'll be delighted to talk to you. Thank you very much for your attention and for your time, and goodbye.